All right, there we go. Great, welcome. You're very warmly welcome. My name is Simon. I'm very loud. Thanks, Matt. My name is Simon. I'm one of the team of ministers here at the church, and we love to organize evenings like this where we try to tackle some of the big issues or some of the big questions that people might have about the claims of the Lord Jesus, the claims of the Christian faith, and so on. And we're tackling one of the big ones this evening. Has science disproved God? Has science disproved God? There will be those who believe that it has. And we're going to think about that question together. And we've got just the right person to walk us through it. We'll get to know our speaker in just a few moments, but just a word on format. After we've got to know our speaker in a moment or two's time, he will present for a while, and then there'll be a short break. And during the short break, there'll be a chance to submit questions. I'll talk us through how to do that when we get there. And we'll finish our sort of organized time together with a question and answer session with Professor Richard Buggs. So as you're listening, you can be storing those questions away. We won't submit the questions until after the presentation, because it may well be that Richard's answered some of your questions by the end of his talk. But I'll talk us through how to submit later on. But let me welcome Professor Richard Buggs. Richard, come and join me here. We're really grateful for you making the trip over. Richard used to be here, a regular here at the church, moved away with family, but great to have you back. Tell us, Richard, where do you live? Who do you live with?
We live just outside a village called Pembury in Kent, and I live there with Hannah and my 4 children, James, Alfie, Elizabeth, and George. George is just 7 months.
Brilliant. Now, you'd call yourself a Christian. Mm-hmm. Tell us, what do you mean by that, and how did it come about?
Well, being a Christian is believing that Jesus is my Lord and Saviour. It's seeing that I need a Saviour, that I don't have any hope of God accepting me, except through somebody else standing in my place, and that place is Jesus, the Son of God, who died on my behalf and on the behalf of every Christian. And it's through him that I can hope to be received by God and accepted by God and spend eternity with him. And so that's the glorious hope I have as a Christian. I was brought up in a family where my parents are Christian, and that was a great privilege. But one thing that was really helpful was they always stressed to me and my siblings that we weren't a Christian just because we were brought up in a Christian home. We had to have a personal faith for ourselves. And for me, I don't think I really had that until I was in my late teens. Had quite a long struggle. I kind of thought I knew how God made someone into a Christian. I thought I kind of knew what I would have to experience to become a Christian, and I had quite a complicated idea of what had to happen. It didn't quite happen like that. But eventually I managed to see just the simplicity of what it means to be a Christian, just to throw yourself on Jesus and just trust completely in him, and not bring any sort of experience or anything of my own at all, but just trust completely in Jesus. And in my late teens, thankfully, that happened.
Brilliant. So you're a Christian. You're also a scientist. How did you get into that, and why do you love it?
Well, I was brought up on a farm, so I was kind of close to nature throughout my life. The farm had animals, had sheep and cattle, and also plants, apples, hops, and arable crops when I was a kid. And I went and studied plant science at university. I tried farming, didn't go very well. Then I went back to university and did a PhD and kind of carried on from there. And so eventually find myself working just up the road at Kew Gardens, doing research there in the Jodrell lab, and also have a post at Queen Mary University of London as well, over the other side of London. Brilliant.
Well, we're really grateful for you coming. Over to you, and we'll come back to Q&A a little bit later on. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Simon, and thank you all for coming this evening, and it's good to be back at Duke Street. I'm standing over the pool where my wife was baptized, so it's always going to be a special place here for me and my family. Well, had science disproved God? And I don't know if it would be possible for me to see the slides on the screen that I'm facing. Otherwise, you can keep seeing my slightly balding head as I turn around to check. Oh, here we are. Part 1, scientific discoveries. Yeah. So I think lots of people have the idea that science has somehow disproved the existence of God, and that before people became scientific, it was possible to believe in God. But today, that's just all out of date. Well, I want to talk about 3 different areas of scientific discovery over the past couple of decades, and just think about whether they are disproving God or actually adding evidence for God's existence. So first of all, I want to talk about DNA. And I spend most of my professional life trying to understand the DNA of ash trees, oak trees, birch trees, and elm trees. And we're trying to understand how that software is encoding a tree. And the kind of things we do is, first of all, sequence the genome, and then we sequence the bits of the genome that are being expressed into RNA, and then we look at which bits are then being turned into protein. And this picture you can see is actually part of the human genome browser, where various bits of data are all being lined up along the human genome to try to figure out what the different parts of the genome are doing. And at Kew, we're doing the same kind of thing, but on plants, and for me, on British broadleaf trees. And it's incredibly difficult. I know that I could spend my whole life just studying the genome of one of these trees, and by the end of my career, we still wouldn't know what every bit of DNA is doing. You know, the human genome has been sequenced for over 20 years now, and we are still, massive teams of scientists with billions of dollars of funding are still trying to work out what everything is doing. It's the most amazing piece of software that tells us how a living organism runs. We've also made a lot of discoveries in recent years about the molecular structures that are encoded in that DNA and the nanomachinery that they encode. So here we are just zooming in on the leaf of a tree. This is, of course, an animation, but this is the kind of thing you see under a microscope. These are the thylakoid membranes you might have done about at school in the chloroplasts. And then stuff that many of you wouldn't have learnt at school because it's too recently discovered, is that when you get to a submicroscopic level, a level that you can only see under an electron microscope, we find that there are these tiny machines. This machine is called ATP synthase. It runs on a flow of hydrogen ions across a membrane, and as they flow across, they turn this amazing turbine structure, and that causes another part of it at the top to change in its conformation, and as it does that, it can take something called ADP and turn it into something called ATP. And these are like little battery packs that get carried around the cells. This is how energy is processed, not just in plants, but also in all of life. So as I stand here talking to you now, the energy that is enabling me to speak and gesticulate is all being processed through these little turbines. I have trillions of them, all turning extremely fast, enabling that energy to be processed. We only discovered the structure of this about 20 years ago. The person who discovered the structure won a Nobel Prize just for working out what the structure was, because it's so complicated. Here's another nano machine. This is called the bacterial flagellum. It's a little motor. Again, it runs on a flow of ions across a membrane, but this time it's actually turning to cause this little propeller that's a hair-like structure on the end to turn, and as it turns, it allows the bacteria to swim around in a watery medium. There are thousands of these, millions of these in my gut at the moment, processing my lunch, or maybe yesterday's dinner, I don't know. But we depend on these all the time. Here's another animation of part of the bacterial flagellum. You can see how intricate this is as a motor. It's absolutely mind-boggling. And very recently it was discovered there's an extra little cog that we didn't know about before, and when this moves, it causes the reversal of the direction of rotation of the flagellum. and so that the flagellum can be going extremely fast at very high RPM in one direction and then suddenly flip and go in the other direction because of this very, very clever little cog that is there. And here's another view of how that cog is working, and you can see how it swings over and drives it the other way. It's like clockwork, except far better. Let's think too about artificial intelligence. This is something that's in the news a lot. Big progress made in recent years in artificial intelligence. Well, a few years ago, the EU funded a project to try to recreate the human brain on a computer, and 600 million euros were given for that project, and large teams of very intelligent scientists were employed for several years to try to recreate the human brain on a computer. And when the project finished, there was a write-up in the journal Nature. Scientists aimed to recreate the brain in a computer. How did it go? Well, the answer is they didn't manage to do it. They couldn't do it. The human brain is more sophisticated than any artificial intelligence that we can make. Even with supercomputers, we can't recreate the human brain. So we naturally have to ask ourselves the question, well, where did all this come from? The software in our DNA, the nanotechnology that it encodes, that enables us to live, the amazing sophistication of the human brain. Where does all of this come from? And, it's not just me as a Christian that asks this question. If you watch the BBC documentary Universe that came out in 2021 with Professor Brian Cox, he makes this same point. Everywhere you look on Earth, there is complexity. So you have to ask yourself, how can it be that such complexity can emerge completely naturally in the universe? When we see this complexity, we think, how on the earth did that get here? And normally, when we look at a piece of software, we know that that software was made by an intelligent agent, often a whole team of intelligent agents with a lot of funding at Microsoft or Apple or somewhere like that. We know that software doesn't just happen by chance. There's not a natural process that we know of that generates any of the software that we know where it came from. We know there are always intelligent agents behind it. And if you start randomly making changes to a piece of software, it very quickly falls over. In fact, even the best software needs patches issued every so often as different vulnerabilities are found within it. That, of course, can't happen with our DNA. It has to work without extra bits of information being added through our lives. If we see even a very simple piece of code, here's just the word hello spelt out with some pebbles on a beach. Even a very simple piece of code like that, 5 letters long, if we see that on a beach made of some natural objects, we infer that there was an intelligence there. Even if we just saw one of those letters, we would infer that an intelligence had made that piece of code. Well, how much more naturally do we think that when we look at 3.2 billion letters in the human genome? Instinctively, we think, well, this must be the product of an intelligent agent. Similarly with nanotechnology, I've shown you some examples of natural nanotechnology that are far more sophisticated than anything we can make. But we know that the most sophisticated bits of human-made nanotechnology are from labs with very intelligent people within them. When we see a piece of molecular machinery, it's natural for us to think, well, that came from an intelligent agent. We just have to look at some quite simple structures. We can look at just 3 stones placed together at somewhere like Stonehenge and immediately infer that must have been done by intelligent agents. You can look at the archway at the top and think, okay, that could have been done by erosion. You look at the one at the bottom and you say, well, that must have been intelligence. All of the time in our lives, we are distinguishing between things that could just happen by chance or naturally and things that are happening deliberately. If you find that the same person is walking behind you every day on your way to work, you immediately think to yourself, do they just happen to live near me and work near me, or do I have a stalker? Is this something that they're deliberately doing or not? If you walk into your home and things are rearranged in your home in a way that are different to how you left them, you immediately think, did a window just blow open and the wind blow things over? Or was there an intelligent agent here who did that? We do this kind of reasoning all the time. And that kind of reasoning, when we look at the world around us, tells us this looks as if it's the result of intelligent activity. This looks as if it was designed. And throughout human history, this has led people to infer that the living world is designed. So there was a debate in ancient Greece between a philosopher called Democritus and one called Socrates. And Socrates made the point, well, look, if I show you a statue made out of stone, and of course at the time that was the height of art and sophistication, to have a lifelike human statue. If I show you that, you immediately admire the artistry and the creativity of the sculptor who made that statue. Well, how much more do you do that when you see the living, moving human being that statue was based on, or one similar? How much more do you have to admire the creativity and artistry of the God who made the human form itself? Democritus, on the other hand, was arguing, well, all of this could have simply come about by chance. Maybe the universe is infinitely large and infinitely old, and there are atoms in the universe that are constantly falling around and bumping into each other, and we just happen to be in that really lucky place in this infinite universe where things happen to have come together to make such sophisticated things as human beings. Not many people found that argument from pure chance convincing at the time, and Socrates was arguing against it when he made this analogy between human craftsmanship and objects in the natural world. And David Sedley, the professor of ancient philosophy at Cambridge a few years ago, in a book about this, makes the point that the things that Socrates was saying were actually highly intuitive to all human beings, and the only reason why he had to formalize them as a philosopher was because he, for the first time, was facing another philosopher who'd come up with an alternative explanation. Up until that point, everyone had just taken as read that the world around them was designed and made by God. And so Socrates' originality isn't really original, it's simply because he was facing up against a new argument that he found very unconvincing. And we see that in older documents, like the Psalms written before Socrates. David writes, "I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, my soul knows it very well." I just look at the human body and it makes me praise God because I can see that I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. And that inference has been natural and intuitive to human beings all the way through history and is still intuitive, I think, to us today. And to my mind, rather than negating that inference, modern science is just giving us fresh evidence of how true that actually is. If just knowing about muscles and bones, you have to praise God because you're fearfully and wonderfully made, well, how much more when you know about DNA and ATP synthase and our inability to recreate the brain with a computer? To my mind, the argument is not getting weaker, the argument is getting more and more powerful. But you might say, that might be true. Okay, I can see the point you're making here, but what about evolution? Hasn't the advance in science also given us explanations about where these things come from? And so while there's part of science that is apparently giving us fresh evidence for God's existence, there's another part of science which is taking that away and explaining it through Darwin's mechanism of evolution. And when Professor Brian Cox asked this question on the BBC, where does all this complexity come from? Of course, that is what he goes to straight away: evolution. This is what he says about it. "No one knows exactly how life on Earth emerged, but what we do know is that at some point, primitive cells living in the ocean began using the sun's energy to power life-giving chemical reactions. This process, known as photosynthesis, unleashed the the sun's creative power and drove the evolution of complexity from primitive bacteria to plants and trees and ultimately to you and me. There's a part of that photosynthetic machinery. Everything you see here, he says, sort of showing a large forest. Everything you see here, every plant on the planet's got a photosystem too. It's comprised of 46,630 atoms all working together in an intricate machine, very efficient. It took billions of years of evolution. So he's saying, yes, there's amazing complexity. Don't know exactly where it came from originally, but once we'd got life, evolution, over billions of years, evolved all of this complexity. Things like the mechanisms that I showed you earlier. Well, it might strike you that what he's saying here is extremely vague. He's not telling us how evolution did it. He's just saying, well, evolution did it. And you might think, well, it's a bit vague because obviously it's a BBC documentary. There's probably a whole load of technical details that scientists have got sorted out about this, but it's just too complicated to fit them into a BBC documentary. Well, I can tell you that's not the case. Scientists haven't got all of this figured out. The explanations that are out there are very vague and very hand-wavy. No one can give you a step-by-step account of how something as complicated as the mechanisms of photosynthesis have evolved. I know someone who is an expert on the structure of photosystem 2, and I said to him, where are we on understanding how photosystem 2 evolved? And he laughed at me and he said, we have no idea. Absolutely no idea. And I said to him, well, what do you think about its origins? And he said, well, I actually think it must have been designed. And he's not someone who's out there saying that in public, as far as I'm aware, but his private view from one scientist to another was that he thinks that must have been designed. That's very much my view, and I suspect there are probably many scientists who are privately thinking this. But someone like Brian Cox is telling us, well, it just evolved over billions of years. Richard Dawkins, an even more famous atheist, says, I could not imagine being an atheist at any point before 1859 when Darwin's Origin of Species was published. Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. So what Richard Dawkins is telling us here is that the argument made by Democritus in ancient Greece, that everything just came about by chance, that is not credible. You can't be an intellectually fulfilled atheist and just say all of this happened by luck. And he's very clear about that in his book, The Blind Watchmaker. We can't just say luck did this. We have to have a mechanism that reduces the amount of luck that we need. And this is what Darwin gives us, says Richard Dawkins. What is it that makes natural selection succeed as a solution to the problem of improbability? This idea that you would have to be just so stupendously lucky to get these structures all in one go that it's just impossible to believe. What makes natural selection succeed as a solution to the problem of improbability? The answer is that natural selection is a cumulative process which breaks down the problem of improbability up into small pieces. Each of the small pieces is slightly improbable, but not prohibitively so. So, to take the analogy I've got in the photo there, if I came down one morning and on the floor in our living room was a circle made of 8 bits of brio train track, a perfect circle made of these classic bits of wooden train track, and then there was a train on the top, and I knew for certain that all of the toys had been put away the night before and there were none left on the carpet. If only that happened. But imagine I knew that had happened that particular day, and we came down and there was this perfect circle. My wife and I would immediately say, well, somebody must have done that. One of the boys must have got up in the night and made that train set. Or maybe a thief broke in and enjoyed brio so much that he got waylaid in making a perfect circle out of brio on the floor? Well, if I said no, it wasn't done by an intelligence, I think that those pieces just happened to fall out of the box of brio just by chance, and they all just happened to fall into place to make a perfect circle. Well, my wife would say, you're crazy to think that could happen by chance. And, the chances of that are just 1 in billions. That would be fair enough. And I would have to admit, yeah, okay, pure chance just isn't a credible explanation here. But let's imagine that actually there was a process going on, a bit like the Darwinian process. And this process says, just imagine that rather than 8 pieces in a perfect circle, 2 pieces are joined together. There are just 2 pieces that are joined together. Could you imagine that could happen purely by chance from bits of brio falling out of a toy box? Well, yes, I could. I mean, it's pretty lucky for 2 bits to join up by chance, but it could happen. I'd be happy to believe that could happen. I'd be happy to believe that a robber hadn't broken into my house and done that. Okay, then imagine that there's a process that says a longer train track made of brio is better than a short one. And so if 2 bits do join together, you retain them together. They get kept together, but then they continue to be thrown around with the rest of the train set. Thousands of times. You just keep on throwing up the train set and seeing what falls out of it. And then over time, this little set with 2 bits of track, you might get a 3rd bit added to it. You could imagine that purely by chance, a 3rd bit could get added to that train track. And then again, thousands of iterations later, maybe another bit would get added. And so over time, maybe this process could build up a train set made up of 8 pieces that come together to make a perfect circle. And so what we've done is we've broken up this event of having this train track made in one go. We've broken it up into 8 different things, eight different additions, each of which are really quite lucky, but not so lucky that we couldn't believe that could happen. Well, this is what the Darwinian mechanism is like. It says, okay, something like a human being is just clearly far too improbable to have come about in one go, but let's just imagine that it came about really slowly over time through random changes in the DNA, and each one of them was pretty lucky to sort of get the right bit of code, but not so lucky that you couldn't believe that it had happened purely by chance. And then you have this process of natural selection which keeps that, and so over time you can very gradually build up complexity step by tiny step, and eventually, get something a bit more complicated. Now, the really important thing to remember about the Darwinian mechanism is that every step has to be a very small step, and also every step has to give you something which is better than what was before. It has to be better so that natural selection can say, I want that, I want to keep that, and so the mutation can spread throughout the whole population, and then you can build on top of that. So you have to be able, if it were true, it would be possible for every biological structure to think up a pathway that it could have been built by, where every step in the pathway is really small, and every part of that pathway gets slightly better than what is there before. And there are no sort of big jumps. And if that is the case, then, as Richard Dawkins says, natural selection is emphatically not a matter of luck. The problem is, though, that even with our very simple brio analogy, we can see that although it might sound plausible at the get-go, as soon as we start thinking about some of the complexities of just building a train set, you start to see how huge amounts of luck become required. So, for example, if this bridge got added to my train set, that bridge will only work as part of that train set if there's a little ramp, and then the bridge, then another little ramp. So you have to get those 3 pieces coming into place one after the other. You can't just have any old piece added to get that bridge. You have to have three altogether. And you don't have to be a mathematician to see that the chances of getting three exactly right pieces all in the right place in a row is actually much, much, much smaller than just any old piece coming and joining in. And so the amount of chance, if I walked down in the morning and that bridge was there, just with the two ramps each side, I would think an intelligence had to be involved. This is immediately far more improbable than just two pieces being joined together. Let's imagine that by this process I'd made a perfect circle, just for the sake of the argument. Well, I'm then kind of stuck. I can't get more complex because I can't make that into a longer train set anymore. What I have to do to get it into a more complex train set is then go backwards. A piece has to come out, and then a junction piece has to be added. And then we kind of start the process again, and more pieces have to be added to that junction. But to go backwards like that, natural selection isn't going to help me go backwards like that. That has to be something that happens by pure chance. And it's well known to population geneticists who work on this kind of problem in biology that when you want to go backwards like that has to happen purely by chance. It's something called genetic drift is needed to make that happen. And so the Darwinian process, for it to work, actually has to involve massively more luck than you might think it would when you first have it presented to you by someone like Richard Dawkins. When you start to think through the complexities of what that would mean in order to make a complex structure, it very soon clearly becomes a matter of far more luck than you would at first think. To make a Brio train track like that, I've actually found by personal experience, is quite tricky. I find myself having to experiment with different pieces just to get the tensions right and to get things matching up. It takes quite a lot of foresight to make just a train track like that. Well, how much more foresight is it going to take to build something as complicated as ATP synthase, or something as complicated as the human brain? This is a really simple structure, and I couldn't imagine how that could come about by a Darwinian process like the one I've described to you in toy form. Well, how much less something like a motor, where every part has to be in place for it to really function. But I don't even have to sort of go down that line of argument to show you that Richard Dawkins doesn't have a satisfactory explanation for how we got here, because his own words make it clear too. So he says this in his book, The God Delusion: "We really need Darwin's powerful crane to account for the diversity of life on Earth," and that's the mechanism of natural selection, "especially the powerful illusion of design." And just note, that's a really interesting choice of words, isn't it? The powerful illusion of design. He's admitting, and he does this more explicitly elsewhere, the living world looks designed. We have this overwhelming impression that it really is designed. But for him, of course, it has to be an illusion because he is an atheist. The origin of life, by contrast, he goes on to say, lies outside the reach of that crane because natural selection cannot proceed without it. And he's saying the same thing as Brian Cox, of course. In the quote I had from him, he said, nobody knows how life first started. You see, the Darwinian process of natural selection can't happen until you actually have life. Until you've got life, until you've got things that self-replicate, you can't have the Darwinian process at all. So the origin of life lies outside the reach of that crane of natural selection, because natural selection cannot proceed without it. He then says, here the anthropic principle comes into its own. We can deal with the unique origin of life by postulating a very large number of planetary opportunities. So what he's saying is maybe there are so many planets in the universe that we can just say, well, we happen to be on the lucky planet where life originated purely by chance. Now notice he's going straight back to the argument that was made by that ancient Greek philosopher Democritus. But clearly he didn't find that argument convincing, because you couldn't be an intellectually fulfilled atheist until Darwin. So it's interesting that he's just having to really resort back to this ancient Greek argument, which he inferred before wasn't very compelling. We can deal with the unique origin of life by postulating a very large number of planetary opportunities. Once that initial stroke of luck had been granted, and the anthropic principle most decisively grants it to us, there are plenty of planets, he claims, natural selection takes over, and natural selection is emphatically not a matter of luck. See how much he wants to get away from luck if he possibly can. Nevertheless, it may be that the origin of life is not the only major gap in the evolutionary story that is bridged by sheer luck, anthropically justified. For example, my colleague Mark Ridley has suggested that the origin of the eukaryotic cell, which is our kind of cell, which we have, was an even more momentous, difficult, and statistically improbable step than the origin of life. The origin of consciousness might be another major gap whose bridging was in the same order of improbability. Natural selection works because it is a cumulative one-way street to improvement. It needs some luck to get it started, and the billions of planets' anthropic principle grants it that luck. Maybe a few later gaps in the evolutionary story also need major infusions of luck with anthropic justification. You see, he's falling back on this ancient Greek argument to get him out of a hole, because he can see that you would still need huge amounts of luck to explain how we got here, even after Darwin, if God is ruled out as an explanation. So he's falling back on Democritus. But it's worse for Dawkins, because Democritus was hypothesizing that the universe was infinitely large and infinitely old, whereas everyone agrees today that the universe had a beginning, it's not infinitely old, and it's not infinitely large either. And so we don't have the probabilistic resources that Democritus thought he had. He thought he had infinite numbers of goes. He had an infinite number of tickets in the lottery, whereas today we know we certainly don't have that. It's a finite number. Dawkins tries to get out of this by saying, well, maybe there's multiple universes as well, which is a huge leap of faith in something that doesn't have any actual evidence for it. So we're left with this problem that nobody can think of an evolutionary pathway for something like this. You know, no scientist can give you a step-by-step pathway by which something like this could evolve, where every step is small and every step is slightly better than the one before. You know, we instinctively look at that and think you would have to get a lot of places ready, a lot of parts ready and in place before something like that is going to even remotely do the job that it's supposed to do. And I think the progress of science is making it harder and harder for someone like Richard Dawkins. So back in 2003, people said, well, we think we've got one of the intermediates for the evolution of the bacterial flagellum, and it's something called the type 3 secretory system. And this is something that some bacteria have, that enables them to inject a toxin into another cell. And superficially, it looks a bit like the base part of the flagellum, especially when you draw it in a sort of cartoon image like this. So people said, okay, here's one of the steps. So it's not that they were claiming we know all of the steps of the pathway. There must be thousands and thousands and thousands of them, but maybe we know just one. Well, since then, the structure of both the flagellum and the type 3 secretory system have been worked out at atomic resolution. And they have, you know, looking at them now, you can see how different they actually are. And in addition, as more data has built up, people generally think that if the two were related in any way, it was the type 3 secretory system that came from the flagellum, not the other way round. One was a degeneration of the other, not one being an improvement on the other. And so over time, the case has actually got weaker for the evolution of this bacterial flagellum. Now, in The Origin of Species, Charles Darwin said, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down, but I can find no such case. Well, I'm sure people in Victorian times debated that statement, but I think today, as we look at what science has discovered about the complexity of life, we find numerous complex nano-organs for which we cannot even imagine a pathway of numerous successive slight modifications by which they could have evolved, driven by natural selection. And so it really takes a very huge leap of faith to say that we evolved, that we came about by a process that didn't involve God. And so you might say, well, why do people say it then at all? And the answer is baked into the way Brian Cox asks the question in his BBC documentary. His question is, how can such complexity emerge completely naturally in the universe? How can it occur without invoking the supernatural? How can complexity have come about without God? And so baked into his question, he is ruling out this explanation of God. And so, of course, the only possible answer to his question is some kind of evolutionary mechanism. You know, if you're ruling out God from the get-go, then you have to have some kind of evolutionary explanation. And I think this is why so many scientists, if you said to them, how did we get here, they would say, well, just purely by evolution. It's because that's the only game in town if you're ruling out God in the way you asked the question to start with. And so in conclusion, in my view, complexity points to God more powerfully than ever due to the discoveries of modern science over the past few decades. The age-old argument for design, which throughout human history has been highly intuitive and obvious to most human beings, that age-old argument has not been refuted by Darwin, despite what someone like Richard Dawkins might claim. And science most definitely has not disproved God. I'd say rather the opposite is giving us more evidence than ever for his existence. Thank you very much.